talking about changes that occur in the brain and then how that affects our ability to think and reason and remember information and what that suggests for technology development for older adults. Now, for those of you who haven't done a lot of studying about the brain, the neuron is kind of the basic part of the brain that is involved in allowing us to do all the things that we do in terms of enjoying a sunset or remembering our first kiss. And we have billions of neurons in the brain. And we used to believe that we had all the neurons we were ever going to have at birth, but we now know that there's a process called neurogenesis that does occur throughout life and allows for new generation of these neurons. What we're going to see, though, is that as people age, there's a decrease in the number of neurons in the brain and also in the rate that neurogenesis can occur. There's also reduction in the connection among neurons. So we have a lot of dendrites that are bringing information into the cell body, and they have a rich connection with other neurons in the brain, as well as the axon that takes information away. And kind of the richer your environment, some of the data that's been done with rats suggests that the more connections these neurons have. And so that's one of the other things that decreases with age. The other thing that we can see is that as the neurons die, they may form around kind of these beta amyloid plaques, and that the axons of the neurons may become tangled. And so we may get plaques and tangles in the brain. Now, plaques and tangles are the neuropathology that we see in Alzheimer's dementia. We now know that Alzheimer's dementia is a neurodegenerative process. It's not something that everyone is going to get, but we do know that most brains do show these plaques and tangles in them. And for most people, we're not going to see a large portion of them until a person reaches the age of 90 or so, unless the person has an Alzheimer's dementia process. Now, the decrease in these neurons in the brain is also going to cause the brain to decrease in weight and size. And just like a lot of these other areas that we've been talking about, our brain volume actually peaks in the 20s and then begins to decline after that. Now, these are some data that are looking at different areas of the brain that have to do with the gray matter, where a lot of the cell bodies are. So I'm just going to point this out here. So the gray area, the darker area here, is the areas that we're looking at. We're looking at the frontal lobe area, so this part of our brain, which is important for thinking and reasoning. There's data from the visual area, and then from one of the cell nuclei called the hippocampus that's important in memory in this graph I'm going to show you. And what this graph is showing you is that different areas of the brain show different amounts of decline in terms of their total volume. So the prefrontal cortex actually shows quite a bit of decline over the lifetime. And in fact, there's hypotheses about aging known as the frontal aging hypothesis, which is that a lot of the deficits that we see in aging result from this decline in the prefrontal area of the brain. The second one is the visual cortex, and you can see that there's not a lot of changes in the visual cortex across the lifetime. And then the last one is the hippocampus, and you can see that that's less linear than what we see with the prefrontal cortex, and so that's an area that's important in memory functioning. So just like our other abilities that we're talking about within the brain, different areas seem to age at different rates or lose neurons. Another change that occurs in the brain is changes in neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are important because they're the way these neurons connect with each other. So we have chemical and electrical impulses that are all working together. And the neurotransmitters are important in a lot of different things, such as memory and processing And one of the hypotheses, this is kind of the dopaminergic system. And for those of you who know something about Parkinson's disease, in Parkinson's disease, we see a decrease in the amount of dopamine in the substantia nigra. And then that causes a lot of the motor system deficits that we see, but it can also cause some of the frontal and the slowing sort of thinking deficits that we see too. So some people have talked about a dopaminergic deficit that may be a result of some of the changes that we see in the aging process. Now, dopamine is also interesting because it projects to different areas of the brain, but it's also been found to be involved in schizophrenia. And there, it's if you have too much dopamine that's going to the prefrontal areas of the brain. Okay, the other thing that we can see is a reduction in the cerebral blood flow. So we need blood flow to the brain because it's important in bringing oxygen and glucose to feed the neurons and the cells in the brain. And as we get older, because of some of the changes that occur in the vascular system, the hardening that occurs in the arteries and veins, we can see a reduction in the amount of cerebral blood flow to the brain. So all these changes that occur in the brain have effects on cognition. And it's important to understand these effects when we're thinking about how we're going to design products for older adults. Now, the first thing, I'm not sure what happened there, but the first thing I want to mention is that aging does not equate with loss in all cognitive abilities. So most of the time when we think about aging, we think everything's going to get worse, everything's going to change, but we do see some cognitive abilities that remain relatively stable across the lifetime. And I'm going to show you examples in just a moment. We always need to keep in mind that there are a lot of individual differences. So I may be able to find a 70-year-old out there whose reaction time is as fast as a 30-year-old. So again, when we're showing this data here, we're talking about mean data, and I've actually gone in and collapsed some of our data to be mean data to show you some of these changes that do occur. And then we're going to talk about, well, how do we compensate? You know, experience, strategies, the brain itself, what does it do to allow us to compensate for some of these age-related changes that occur? And here is a great example of compensation. So this is functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is showing the areas of the brain that are lighting up when a person is doing a task. And early on, this data was very confusing because we saw younger adults performing a task and seeing certain areas light up. And then we had older adults perform the task and we saw more areas lighting up. And we weren't expecting that to happen because fMRI is supposed to be, those are the brain areas you're using when you're doing a task. So why is it that younger adults are using less of their brain to do a task? And over time, and doing a number of different experiences and splitting people into older adults who were performing poorly and older adults who were performing as well as our younger adults, what we actually found is that, or the way we're interpreting this data, is that older adults are compensating by pulling in other areas of the brain or maybe using other strategies. So if this is how a younger adult is doing it, and this is an older adult who's not doing as well, that older adult is using the same areas of the brain, maybe activating more, but it's not helping them. Here's an older adult that's doing as well as the younger adult, and what that older adult has done is use other areas of the brain to help compensate so that their performance is just as well as that of a younger adult. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. All right, so when we talk about the cognitive aging process, we also have to keep in mind that there are lots of variables that can moderate that process of cognitive aging. So two big ones are things like education and intelligence. There's this concept that's used within the neuropsychological literature called brain reserve. So it's this idea that we have kind of this this capacity or this amount of reserve that's built into our brain that may differ from person to person. And one way that you can increase that amount of reserve is to continue to engage in mental activities. So if you become more highly educated, if you have higher intellectual abilities, the thought is that you've got more brain reserve. And then as you start to lose some of these neurons as part of the aging process, that brain reserve is going to protect you for a longer period of time. So we won't see those negative effects of the aging process till a later point in time. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Occupation. If you are in an occupation where you're engaged in a repetitive type of activity, or you have to use your memory a lot, you have to use your reasoning abilities a lot, you have to use your visual spatial abilities a lot, that may protect you from changes that occur in that specific function. Now, on the other side of things, if you have a history of any sort of insult to your brain, so you've had a traumatic brain injury, or maybe you have diabetes or hypertension that can cause small strokes in the brain, those sorts of things can act in the opposite direction. And if you're losing some brain tissue and then you add the natural aging process on top of it, you may see the effects of aging earlier. The other things when talking about cognitive aging is we need to make sure that we're talking about aging that has to do with cognition, the memory, the attention, those things that we're looking at, not how we're getting the information in or how we're taking it out, right? So if I'm looking at memory and I'm giving a person a list learning test and they can't hear me, for example, then I haven't really tested their memory, I've tested their hearing for the list, right? Or if I'm looking at some sort of visual spatial task and I'm asking a person to draw something, and they have a tremor, and I count off because of their tremor, then I'm not really testing their visual spatial abilities, I'm actually looking at their motor functioning, right? So we have to take that into account. And then psychological conditions like depression. So depression, we know, can cause people to give up earlier on tests, can slow the speed at which they're kind of processing information, and we need to take that into account when we're looking at our data too.